This story began the same as one you are likely familiar with a young, green-haired boy learning that not all men are created equal. However, from that point on, everything changed. As Izuku Midoriya lay in the dirt contemplating the sad realization he had come to, a shadow crossed over his face. He looked up and saw a young blonde-haired boy with blue eyes, hand forward, offering to pull Izuku up.
"Hey,"
the boy said.
"I'm Jaune."
Izuku accepted the boy's hand and introduced himself. As he was pulled up and began to walk with the boy, Izuku grew curious as to why he decided to help him. With a shrug, Jaune responded, "Why not?" and stated that his mother always said, strangers are just friends you hadn't met yet. Izuku was happy, but also sad upon hearing that phrase. He explained that not many people wanted to be his friend these days. When Jaune asked why that was, Izuku sadly divulged that he didn't have a quirk. The green-haired boy was surprised when, in response to this revelation, Jaune asked him what a quirk was. Jaune Arc was not a normal young lad. Rather, he was the only son of the world's greatest hero, All Might. When he was studying abroad, Toshinori Yagi met and fell in love with a French-American woman named Juniper Arc. Romance blossomed between them, but Toshinori felt conflicted. He didn't want to put this woman in harm's way, in the sights of the man known as All for One, especially after his master had given up her own family to protect them, the same master he had recently lost. Eventually, he told his love everything, and she insisted even, that she would stay at his side. After a while, he relented. They returned to Japan and began a family, both agreeing that they would keep it a secret from anyone but their closest friends and allies, and would keep their children, to the best of their abilities, away from anything involving heroes and villains. Of course, that was easier said than done in a superhuman society. Izuku explained that quirks were people's superpowers that they were born with, and that not many people lacked one. Jaune, of course, knew of these superpowers, but hadn't specifically heard the word quirk to describe them. Jaune pondered the revelation and then stated to Izuku that he didn't think he had one either. Izuku was surprised. He hadn't met another quirkless person before, at least not one his own age. More so, he was happy to have a potential new friend who shared his burden. The two continued to talk, and eventually the topic was brought up of heroes. Jaune exclaimed that that was what he was going to be when he grew up. Yes, despite his parents' best efforts, Jaune had learned that the profession of hero existed and, more importantly, that his father was one of them. Izuku was excited to see that his new friend shared his aspirations, but felt the need to bring up what others had told him, that they couldn't be heroes because they were quirkless. Jaune was quick with his rebuttal that he thought that was dumb. His dad was a hero, and he was just really strong. They could probably get like him by just lifting a bunch of weights. Izuku was about to ask what hero Jaune's father was, but was stopped in his tracks with Jaune's next declaration. That even if they were weak alone, maybe they'd be stronger as a team. That he and Izuku could be heroes together. For the briefest moment in Izuku's eyes, Jaune's smiling face was replaced by another, the one that Izuku had watched countless times through a computer screen. Jaune was confused when his new friend suddenly burst into tears. The two later returned to their mothers and asked them to exchange contact information, hoping to stay in touch with one another. They parted ways and returned to their homes. However, Jaune's time with Izuku sparked a thought in his head. He brought it up at the next family dinner, asking his parents if he had a quirk. His parents froze in their eating, and Jaune elaborated, being confused since sometimes you couldn't see someone's quirk. His mother explained that if he inherited her quirk, he'd start to see signs of it in the next year or two, her power being a unique one that could only be discerned after some time. Jaune asked about if he inherited his dad's quirk, but his parents told him that it was impossible, refusing to elaborate further. Jaune brushed it off, saying that it didn't really matter. Quirk or no quirk, he was gonna be a hero, just like his dad. The silence in response to that statement was deafening. Years went by, and Jaune saw no sign of a quirk awakening within him. Moreover, anytime he brought up becoming a hero, his parents tried to steer the conversation in another direction. In particular, they bring up how any profession could do heroic things. Doctors, teachers, or even crossing guards. Deep down, Jaune understood what that meant, what they thought of his dream, but he continued to keep his head up. Then, that day came. All Might battled all for one. He won, but at a terrible cost to his own health. While visiting the hospital, his father confined to bed rest by both Recovery Girl and his mother, Jaune faced one of the hardest moments in his life.
Don't worry, Dad. Once I become a hero, I'll be out there with you to make sure you don't get hurt like this again.
All Might, frustrated by being unable to do hero work and terrified for his son's life, snapped and angrily told Jaune that he couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Jaune, heartbroken, tried to bring up his idea of working together with others to make up for being weak.
If you can't protect a single person on your own, what good are you as a hero?
All Might regretted his words as soon as they left his mouth, and he saw the hurt and sadness on his son's face. Jaune ran from the room before he could say anything else. A week passed, and All Might found himself once again being pestered by his sidekick, Sir Night-Eye, begging him to stop being a hero for the sake of his own life. When All Might brought up the fact that he couldn't do that because he didn't have a successor, Night-Eye responded that he had a son who wanted to be a hero, didn't he? All Might was upset, having already told Night-Eye about his hesitations in letting Jaune pursue heroism, and this began the breakdown of their relationship. However, he did take the thought into consideration. He hadn't wanted to let Jaune become a hero out of fear of One for All, but One for All wasn't an issue anymore. He himself had seen to that. And so, All Might made a decision. Jaune's mother brought him to the hospital at the request of his father. His father apologized to him for how he acted before, saying he was out of line. He also gave Jaune an offer. His high school entrance exams would be in 6 years. If he could get himself into a condition All Might saw as worthy, he would give him a path to becoming a hero. Jaune jumped at the chance, taking it upon himself to train and become stronger. However, the words All Might said to him stuck in his head. Because of this, Jaune never asked anyone for help, despite the fact his father would have been able to make a much more effective training regimen for him. Eventually, he came across an old beach turned into a garbage dump. Thinking about how his father always talked about the importance of helping the community as a hero, he decided to clean the beach as both exercise and community service. However, with nobody there with him, he fell victim to a mishap when a pile of junk too heavy for him to lift alone landed on him, trapping him without his phone nearby. Lucky for him, the world was not without its heroes, and his came in the form of one Izuku Midoriya. Izuku, who had been walking by the beach on his way home, heard someone call for help. He ran to where he heard the sound and was shocked to see his old friend Jaune there. While they had stayed in touch over the years, Jaune had grown distant in the last few years after his father had apparently been hurt fighting a villain. Izuku helped his friend escape from his trap, but noticed that Jaune seemed despondent. Izuku asked if he was okay, to which Jaune responded that no, he wasn't. It was bad enough that he had gotten trapped by biting off more than he could chew, but it was even worse needing someone else to save him.
I don't want to be the damsel in distress, I want to be the hero! If I can't even take care of myself now, what good am I?
He fell to the ground with his question. For a moment, Izuku didn't know what to do, what to say to help his friend. After that moment, he responded that Jaune was right, that not all men are created equal, and some people, like the two of them, were too weak to be the hero of the story. But that's okay. It's okay to be too weak to be the hero, because as he learned when they first met, sometimes all you needed to do to be a hero was to support someone who had never had support before. Just as Jaune had been the first to encourage Izuku's dream all those years before, he would be the first to encourage Jaune's now. Izuku reached out his hand and told Jaune that they could be heroes, together. Jaune, though still battling with his father's words, felt joy spread through him at finally having someone who believed in him. He took Izuku's hand. More time passed, and Jaune continued training, this time with Izuku training alongside him for help and encouragement. At the age of 14, 1 year before the UA entrance exams would take place, Jaune went to his father, believing he was ready and taking him to the beach he and Izuku had cleared. After a few tests, All Might begrudgingly agreed. With a heavy sigh, he plucked a hair from his head and told Jaune,
Eat this.
What?
All Might took time to explain One for All to his son, and Jaune was left shocked. He paused for a moment and asked his father if this power could be given to 2 people instead of 1. When his father responded no, Jaune hesitated, thinking of Izuku. Finally, he took the hair and swallowed it, feeling like a jerk all the while. Jaune and his father returned home later that day, Jaune sporting a completely shattered arm after trying his new power for the first time. Needless to say, they both got into a lot of trouble. Jaune, however, did have a breakthrough with his powers a few months later. While at the breakfast table, contemplating his newest broken limb, which Recovery Girl had refused to heal, his sister Saffron spoke up telling him that he needed to eat his cereal. It was getting all soggy at the bottom while his top was still completely dry. As Jaune moved the cereal around in his bowl, it hit him. He was a bowl of cereal. And One for All was the milk. If he could circulate the power all around his body, maybe he could control how soggy he got. The metaphor broke down at that point, but to Jaune it didn't matter. He stood up and began channeling his power all around his body. As bolts of electricity began to run across his skin, he knew that, though it may take some work, he could control the power, and this new ability would help. Jaune grabbed the box of pumpkin peats he had poured his cereal from and kissed it, paying no mind to the red-headed girl around his age pictured on the front of the box.
Pumpkin Pete, you are truly the greatest of heroes.
That night, Jaune found himself in a strange dream. His vision was blurry, only having sight in one of his eyes, and even that being obstructed by a fuzzy black energy surrounding it. He could only say a single thing, a white-haired, sickly-looking man. He seemed wary, even as he smiled at Jaune. I never thought there'd be a power that would affect One for All like this. I wonder how you'll use it. Jaune woke up in a cold sweat, and somehow, the exact reason he didn't know, he understood One for All so much better. He understood that there was more than the stockpiling ability within this quirk. He could almost feel the quirks within, though he wasn't sure when or even if he'd be able to use them. More importantly, he understood his own quirk, his original quirk. The quirk passed down through the Arc family was known as amplification. This quirk allowed its users to amplify the physical and quirk-related abilities to anyone it was applied to, including its own user. A simple, if effective, quirk in theory, but its real strength came in the fact that it was constantly active, and, if not being aimed elsewhere, would constantly be in effect on itself. So, though it is essentially absent for the first 7 years of its user's life, due to starting off so weak, it is constantly increasing in power and expanding in range. Jaune's version of this quirk should have been the most potent incarnation yet, except for a single problem. Jaune's quirk could only be used to amplify others, not himself. As such, the quirk also couldn't affect itself, meaning it couldn't improve its power or range, making Jaune effectively quirkless. However, the power it should have been using to improve itself didn't just disappear into the aether. It was stored over the course of 14 years to be released into the first thing amplification could reach. In this case, One for All, before it was fully recognized as Jaune's quirk. More particularly, the aspect of it that came before it was One for All, the power relating to quirk transferal. As Jaune woke up and realized this, he knew what he had to do. He called Izuku and told his groggy friend to get to the beach. When they met each other, Jaune started the conversation by activating One for All and making lightning dance across his skin, causing Izuku to fall back onto the ground. Jaune explained his quirk to his friend, how he got it from his father, and what he realized from the dream. Izuku was confused and asked what it all meant, why Jaune was telling him.
I think I can give you part of this power, if you want it.
Jaune smiled and reached his hand out to Izuku like he had the day they first met, the sun beginning to rise behind him.
Izuku, we can be heroes, together.
This isn't the story of someone becoming the greatest hero in the world. This is a story of legacy and friendship. And most importantly, this is the story of finding strength in weakness. Jean Arc did not feel confident. Though he had told Izuku Midoriya that they would become heroes together after UA's written entrance exam, he wasn't sure he was even gonna make it into the school. While he wasn't dumb, academics certainly weren't his strong suit. And to make matters worse, he had gotten lost. Despite his father being All Might, he had never actually been to the UA campus, and he was getting a bit worried considering he needed to learn how to do the practical exam, and he couldn't find the auditorium. His own worries were put on the back burner, however, when he heard not quite an explosion, but close enough to warrant investigation. When he got to the source of the sound, he saw a beautiful girl with white hair walking away. He thought to go after her to try and learn her name, but instead decided to do the heroic thing and go towards the other girl. The one who had fallen to the soot-covered ground in misery, and he could hear muttering, "Welcome to UA." He stepped forward, offered his hand to her, and introduced himself. And thus, as in so many other worlds, Jean Arc met Ruby Rose. Their interaction as they walked through the UA campus trying to find their way to the auditorium was much like the one Jean had had as a child with Izuku. Only instead of discussing quirklessness, Jean brought up how Ruby seemed to be a bit too young to actually be going to UA. Ruby confirmed that she was only actually 13 and had gotten into a bit of trouble for illegally using her quirk to stop an escaping criminal. In order to help her, Principal Nezu offered her a deal to try and enter UA early. Not wanting to be labeled as a villain before she even turned 15, Ruby agreed. Jean was impressed and admittedly a bit self-conscious. This 13-year-old had already done more heroics than he had when he was supposed to be the heir to the greatest hero to ever live. Still, he brushed it off, and was happy to have Ruby as a new friend. She reminded him a bit of Izuku, and for Ruby, she was just happy to have someone who was easier to talk to. Though that didn't help the embarrassment they both felt when they found their way to the auditorium and the presentation had already started. By a strange twist of good luck, they ended up going to the same testing grounds for their practical exam. But in a not-so-strange twist of bad luck, the nervousness combined with the bumpy bus ride left Jean puking on the ground as soon as they got there. No, in this world, Jean does not escape the moniker of Vomit Boy. While there were many other applicants at their same testing grounds, two were particularly notable for Jean. The white-haired girl that had gotten into a confrontation with Ruby before they met, and a strong-looking red-haired girl that Jean didn't get a good chance to look at before it was announced that the practical exam had begun. People started running before Jean could even know what was happening, and he was surprised to see Ruby at the head of the pack having turned into a burst of rose petals and dashed forward. Jean activated One for All and ran in as quickly as he could. When he encountered his first robot, he ran forward, destroying it with a single punch, and discovering that punching things really hurt. While he had done a lot of physical training, that was to get his body ready for his quirk. He did not have much in the way of combat training. While it certainly wasn't as bad as the time he had broken his arm when he first got his quirk, he really did not like punching metal. It was then that he saw that Ruby had grabbed a piece of one of the robots and was using it as a kind of dagger, using her quirk to dash behind 1 and 2 pointers and striking at their weak spots. Taking a cue from his new friend, Jean ripped off some of the armored plating from the robot he'd destroyed and used it as a kind of shield, both to block any attacks coming toward him and others, and just, running through things. Jean, now with 31 points from destroying the villain bots, was feeling pretty confident. This confidence drained, however, when the 0-pointer arrived. Jean found himself very afraid of the behemoth before him, and was preparing to run away when he saw that Ruby was still near it, next to a pile of rubble that, upon a closer inspection, he saw had the white-haired girl buried underneath it, holding it off of herself with some strange glyphs. He stopped himself from running and muttered to himself,
I need to get back there. They need help.
He was then surprised to see the strong-looking red-haired girl from earlier standing next to him, and hearing her say, "Let's do this." Jaune nervously nodded, but then confessed he didn't know if he had enough power to stop that thing. At least, not without destroying his body, which he kept to himself. The red-haired girl, who would later introduce herself as Nora, grinned and grabbed his shoulder, still coursing with the lightning from One for All. Over with Ruby, she was desperately trying to pull the rubble away from the girl who had called herself Jaune. She heard the zero-pointer drawing closer and looked up to see the foot standing right above them. She closed her eyes in fear and prepared to be crushed, only for the metal to never come down on her. She looked over and saw Jaune and Nora holding the foot above their heads. Nora had used her quirk to absorb the lightning from One for All and channel it into her muscles, matching Jaune's strength and allowing the both of them combined to keep the foot steady. Unfortunately for Jaune, Nora was much shorter than him, so while she stood tall holding the foot above her head, Jaune had to bend down slightly, releasing a small groan of, "My back." Moments later, Ruby was able to finally release Weiss and dash her away, doing the same for Jaune and Nora once she came back. The four of them stood around looking at the zero-pointer, wondering what they should do. Weiss suggested they just leave, it wasn't worth any points. Jaune was going to agree with her. Run and live was a plan he could get behind. But Ruby shook her head. She told them that they were training to become heroes, and a hero wouldn't let a threat like this stand. The other three were surprised by the passion the 13-year-old spoke with, before Jaune felt a bit of shame for his own desire to run away. Jaune nodded his head in agreement, followed shortly by Nora and then Weiss. Ruby smiled and then awkwardly asked if anyone had a plan on how to stop it. While the others were quiet, Jaune looked up at the towering robot, an idea forming in his head. He turned to Nora and asked how much electricity she thought she could absorb. After Jaune explained his plan, they all set about their roles. Ruby flew around the zero-pointer's head, grabbing its attention, while Weiss used her glyphs to mitigate collateral damage. All the while, Nora stood with Jaune, him feeling his muscles strain as he increased his percentage of One for All. He didn't want to risk overwhelming Nora with 100%, so instead he channeled about 50. He was pretty sure he'd need to go to Recovery Girl after that for bone fractures, but hopefully it would work. Finally, Nora absorbed the energy, and Jaune gave the signal. He threw Nora up with as much power from One for All as he could bear, while Weiss created a path in glyphs for Ruby to catch her. Ruby intercepted Nora and sped the two of them toward the zero-pointer's head, crashing into it and leaving a huge indentation as it fell backwards. As Ruby brought them both to a rooftop to look down at their work, Jaune looked up at them in amazement, while the exam ended almost immediately afterward. The next few weeks had less excitement. Jaune's father was busy preparing to start teaching at UA, something that he had to make Jaune promise not to tell anyone, while Jaune's mother was stressed out. Apparently her half-sister Amber, a hero in America, had gone missing at around the time of the entrance exam, and no one had been able to find her. Jaune was somewhat worried for the aunt he had never met, but he couldn't really do anything to help her at the moment. When Jaune's results for his entrance exam came in, he was excited. He had barely passed the written exam, sure, but he had landed at 3rd place in the practical exam, having received 31 villain points and 45 rescue points. The only two people ahead of him was someone named Bakugo, who he felt like he might have heard of from someone before, but he wasn't sure, and Ruby, who had gotten only 24 villain points, but a whopping 60 rescue points, landing her firmly in 1st place with 84 points. He was even more excited when he went to talk to Izuku later that day and found out he had passed too. His friend had only been able to achieve 10 villain points and had been very despondent since then, thinking that he had no chance of making it into UA. But the rescue points he received from helping others during the exam had pushed him just barely into making it in. When Izuku told Jaune had to let him know that he was floating off the ground before the green-haired boy used his energy tendrils to pull himself back down. Now would be a good time to tell you what Jaune did to help Izuku at the end of the last part. After realizing that his hidden quirk of amplification had attached to One For All's transferal capabilities, and in turn revealing to him that other quirks were also stored in his father's gift to him, he believed that he could transfer some parts of those quirks to other people, while still keeping One For All within himself. In his mind's eye, it looked as though each of the quirks from previous users of One For All had had copies created for each user since the original wielder of that quirk. While he couldn't tell what most of the quirks were, and he wasn't able to use them for himself, two of them had come to the forefront of his mind. Two that he thought could work very well for Izuku. The quirk of the 7th wielder of One For All, Float, and the quirk of the 5th wielder, Black Whip. He and Izuku both knew that when combined, they could create some very interesting combinations. And it also could be passed off as an evolution of his mother's quirk, being telekinesis and bringing things closer to her. Jaune was able to transfer the quirks to him, and the two of them named the combined ability Slingshot. When Jaune told All Might about this, he was surprised and a bit frustrated that his son hadn't told him in advance, but decided that One For All was now Jaune's to do with as he wished. When Izuku asked Jaune what class he was in, stating that he himself had been placed in 1A, Jaune finally looked at his own assignment and was confused. On the paper, it said he was in class 1L, which he had never heard of before. When he asked his father about it, All Might explained that Class 1L was a new experiment from Principal Nezu for students with extenuating circumstances, as well as those who wanted to pursue both the hero course and another course alongside it. It even included a dormitory system for those who could not commute. Jaune accepted the explanation, but was disappointed he wasn't going to be in the same class as Izuku because of his extenuating circumstances. When the first day of classes finally arrived, Jaune was pleasantly surprised to see that Ruby, Nora, and Weiss had all been placed in the same class as him. He might not have his best friend with him, but at least he still had some people he knew. He was going to go greet them, but was interrupted by their homeroom teacher, Professor Glinda Goodwitch, showing up. She told them all to get to their seats, and her authoritative voice ensured that they listened. Jaune found his seat next to a red-haired girl that he didn't know, but must have been popular considering how many people were surrounding her before Goodwitch came in. He smiled and waved at her, and she did the same, though hers seemed a bit strained. Goodwitch gave them a rundown of what their life at UA would likely be like, and then gestured them toward the gym uniforms they were provided. She told them that after orientation, they would be heading out to the courtyard to perform a quirk assessment test, then muttering about how it was actually a very good idea when it wasn't being used to threaten students. Jaune couldn't help but think that there was probably some history there. Jaune found orientation to be quite dull, but was looking forward to the quirk assessment test, though everyone seemed much more excited than even he felt. While he had taken physical assessment tests in his homeschooling, he hadn't had a quirk for most of his life to feel like he was missing out on using. He could tell they were looking forward to finally being able to cut loose. Jaune just hoped he didn't make a fool of himself. And in a shocking twist of fate, luck actually turned in his favor. With the tests going as you might expect of them, Ruby dominating any speed-based tests, and Jaune consistently placing in the upper echelons of pretty much anything, having the all-around boost from One For All doing wonders for his scores. He was slightly annoyed how Nora kept using him as a battery for any strength-based test, but her friendly and happy demeanor not letting him ever get too frustrated. The ball throw test did have some surprises for him though, with Jaune only placing 5th overall in the class. The first surprise was when a girl named Trivia Vanille used her quirk to create a solid illusion of herself that just carried the ball until Goodwitch told her to stop, placing her firmly in 1st place. And then the second surprise, coming when a blonde girl, who he had seen Ruby standing next to before, jumped at him and told him to punch her in the face as hard as he could. In surprise of the action, he did so. When her eyes turned red and her hair burst into flames in response to that, Jaune came to the conclusion that she was just really scary, especially when she beat his score because of it. The others who beat his score were the only two that scored higher than him in overall rankings. Two red-haired, green-eyed girls who gotten in through recommendations. Their names were Penny Polendina and Pyrrha Nikos. Jaune found their similarities in appearance and them both getting in through recommendations, along with both of their names starting with P, to be a bit funny. Pyrrha's quirk was called Polarity and allowed her to control metal. She used it mostly to slightly augment her physical capabilities, using metal bracelets and anklets to make her run faster and go farther when jumping. While on the ball throw, she connected a metal hair clip to the ball and used it to accelerate it to an insane speed. Penny's quirk was called Android, and Jaune didn't really get it. It was apparently a powerful physical enhancer type quirk, but also allowed her to shoot green lasers from her hands and feet, which in turn allowed her to fly. Jaune thought that quirk sounded pretty overpowered, which was ironic coming from him. It just didn't sound like a real quirk to him, and something was itching at the back of his head, but he let it be. After the quirk apprehension test, he learned that apparently some kid with grapes on his head from UA had gotten expelled, but he didn't really know anything about that. He met up with Izuku after school, and so, their life at the Hero Academy began. The first couple of weeks were pretty standard school in Jaune's opinion, with two notable exceptions. The first being their first heroics class, where they would do combat training. Jaune had been paired with Pyrrha and learned that apparently she was kinda famous. He apologized that he had never heard of her, but she seemed strangely happy. Jaune didn't really get it. I mean, if you were famous, why wouldn't you want people to know who you were? Still, he had the feeling that this was the beginning of a strong friendship. They were even able to win their first combat exercise, with Jaune coming up with a plan and Pyrrha's prodigious combat ability allowing her to execute it flawlessly. On a similar note, Ruby had gotten paired with Penny, and the two of them seemed to hit it off immediately, though Penny seemed much more clingy to her first official friend than Ruby did. The other exception was when they were electing class representatives. Goodwitch decided to let them vote, and at the end, Jaune and Ruby were tied with 4 votes each. They tried deciding who would take the role with rock, paper, scissors, but after their 5th tie in a row, Goodwitch got frustrated and declared that they would just share the job. At lunch, Jaune would usually eat with either Izuku and his friends from Class 1A, or his own friends from Class 1L, being mostly Ruby, Nora, and Pyrrha, and the people that came along with them. Namely, Ruby's scary sister Yang and her friend Blake, as well as Penny, Nora's friend Lai Ren, and Weiss, who was just a big fan of Pyrrha. That day, Jaune decided to sit with Class 1L to ask who the 4 people who voted for him were. Though Pyrrha was a bit surprised that he didn't vote for himself, she revealed that she was one of the people who did. Nora chimed in that she also voted for him and got Ren to as well. Finally, Ruby chimed in and said that she was the last one who voted for him. Jaune was surprised by this and revealed that he had actually voted for her. They didn't get into it at the time, but both of them believed that the other had more leadership qualities, with Ruby thinking about the tactical mind Jaune had shown in the battle against the Zero Pointer, and Jaune thinking about how Ruby had showcased more heroic qualities than pretty much anyone he'd ever met, aside from maybe his dad and Izuku. They then worked out that Yang, Blake, and Penny had voted for Ruby, while Weiss had voted for herself. Finally came the day of the first field trip of the year, going to the USJ. Goodwitch told them how, in an attempt to save time, Class 1L would be split in half, with one half being sent with Class 1A to the USJ and the other half going with Class B later. Jaune would go with Class 1A along with his friends, except for Penny, who had been placed into the second group. Along with them would be going the girl named Trivia and another student named Emerald Sustre. Jaune was glad to be able to go there with Izuku and his friends from Class 1A, but the entire bus ride, he couldn't help but feel like something was off. And it wasn't just his motion sickness this time. Something just didn't feel right. And when he got to the USJ, it got even worse. Suddenly, he felt a shooting pain in his head, and he knew that danger was coming. He looked up ready to call out to warn people, but it was too late. In the middle of the USJ, villains had arrived. The next moments were a blur as Jaune felt as though his head was splitting open from pain. His vision flickered between the shade of a man that had appeared before his class and the image of a tall man with scars running across his eye. Suddenly darkness surrounded him and he felt himself being pulled into it. After a moment he fell roughly into a location he was unfamiliar with. Stony walls surrounded him, and by his side were Ren, Nora, and Pyrrha, as well as 3 students from Class 1A that he hadn't met. Them, as well as a not insignificant amount of villains. Even so, as he stood up, he didn't feel particularly worried. While the villains were numerous, 7 in-training heroes from the world's finest hero academy likely wouldn't have much of an issue with them. That's what he thought, until once more he felt the splitting pain in his head as a tall, lanky man stepped forward.
Well, aren't I lucky? I thought I'd have to go looking for you, but it seems I chose the right starting point.
He spoke to Pyrrha, but it was Nora's reaction that drew Jaune's attention. She looked as though she knew him, and asked him what he was doing there. He laughed.
Why I'm here matters not to you, or you. Well, you do interest me.
The word sent a shiver down Jaune's spine as the cruel yellow eyes bore into him.
No, I'm only here for her.
He pointed toward Pyrrha. Jaune and Nora instinctively went to stand in front of their friend, but before another word could be spoken, Ren dashed forward and attacked, his blow being lazily knocked aside by the man. Through gritted teeth, he spoke a name. Deathstalker. The name was only vaguely familiar to Jaune. Some kind of serial killer that had been in the news a few years ago. Ren's attack sparked the conflict for the rest of them. Jaune saw something move behind Deathstalker and remembered the man's quirk, Scorpion. A mutation-type quirk that enhanced the man's physical abilities, as well as granting him a scorpion-like stinger that held incredibly deadly toxin. Deathstalker's tail struck out and would have hit Ren if not for Pyrrha intervening and blocking it with one of her metal bracers. The 2 of them fought the superpowered serial killer, and Jaune wanted to join them, but saw that the Class 1A students were struggling against the other villains. Instead, he powered up one for all and reached his hand out to Nora, allowing her to power up off of his lightning before throwing her toward Deathstalker. The man effortlessly blocking his supercharged friend with his tail left Jaune worried, but he decided to trust in his classmates. With Jaune's help, he and the 1A students were able to quickly defeat all of the villains that were surrounding them, including the villain with an electricity quirk that very briefly set off the pain in Jaune's head, before he realized that it seemed to be alerting him when things were threatening him. However, their battle did not finish before the battle between Ren, Nora, Pyrrha, and the Deathstalker had started moving inward toward the center of the USJ. Jaune knew that he had to catch up, but then realized one of those 1A students had a quirk that generated electricity. So with a quick, "Sorry about this," he grabbed the boy with a lightning bolt in his hair and raced toward his friends. When Jaune arrived at the center of the USJ, it was chaos. Ruby, Weiss, Blake, and Yang had made their way to the center of the USJ as well, and were fighting villains to leave their teachers open to deal with the bigger threats. However, while Professor Goodwitch had engaged with a woman in a black mask, whose quirk seemed to be generating fire, the Class 1A professor was being held down by a hulking beast. Meanwhile, Nora and Ren were on the ground, each trying to catch their breath after their battle against Deathstalker. Pyrrha was still fighting him though. Her movements were a blur as she accelerated her body through various pieces of metal in her costume. Jaune placed the 1A student next to Nora and told her to charge up, then leapt toward Deathstalker. He increased his output of One for All to 15% and felt his muscles and bones strain under the power. But as he quickly landed a blow against the Deathstalker, he was sent flying back. That seeming to be the first major piece of damage the villain took. Deathstalker flying past him seemed to distract the man with hands all over his body, and moving to take this opening, Blake attacked him. A brief exchange occurred, which left the villain visibly frustrated. Blake's quirk was Shadowcat. Along with having heightened instincts, she could create shadowy visages of herself, which would push her out of harm's way. Thanks to this, the villain was unable to grab her, while she peppered him with hits. After just a few moments of this, the villain yelled out with frustration, "Nomu!" In the blink of an eye, the monster that had previously been holding down the 1A teacher appeared before Blake with a fist raised. It was too fast for her to react even with her quirk, but Yang had come to help and pushed Blake out of the way, a smirk on her face. Yang's semblance was called Burn. This quirk came in 2 parts, the more simple aspect of it being that the higher temperature it was, the stronger Yang got. She'd inherited this from her father, the daylight hero Sun Dragon. Meanwhile, the second part of her quirk allowed her to absorb some of the kinetic energy she would take from attacks, and convert it to thermal energy which she released through her hair. This allowed her to take less damage and become stronger with every attack that she took. Yang's plan was to get hit by the monster, and send back a hit that would blow them away. As Yang was hit, an inferno erupted. The UA students and teachers were able to dodge out of the way and avoid taking much damage from the blast. But almost every villain in the area was blown away. But when the smoke cleared, Yang was 30 feet back from where she had been standing, and her arms crossed in front of her were a mottled red and purple, a color familiar to Jaune from when he had shattered his own limbs using One for All. She stood for just a moment before she collapsed unconscious. Jaune heard Ruby call out her sister's name, and saw as her eyes seemed to glow for a moment before fading. Blake rushed to get Yang out of the battle area, and the villain with hands all over him, seemingly the leader, told the hulking beast,
"Clean up the trash, Nomu, then kill the rest of these students."
The monster, Nomu, had severe burns from Yang's blast, but they seemed to be rapidly healing before suddenly they stopped. Jaune looked over and saw that the 1A professor, Eraserhead, had activated his quirk and was staring down the Nomu. He also saw that Deathstalker had changed targets and was running toward the underground hero. Jaune called out to Pyrrha and heard her reply in affirmative before she used her quirk to flatten one of her bracers into a round shield. After a moment he heard Deathstalker scream, but he didn't see what happened because he had something else to take care of. The Nomu had gone to take out the trash, moving toward Ren, who was still recovering on the ground. Jaune ran as fast as he could and stood in front of his friend. The pain in his head was blinding, screaming at him to get out of the way, but doing that would leave Ren to die. So he did the only thing he could. He powered up One for All to 100% throughout his entire body. The golden streaks of lightning that covered him turned to a blinding white, and Jaune felt as though he was being crushed from his own power. But as the Nomu's fist came down, he stopped it dead in its tracks. Jaune didn't know if he could handle another hit, but he didn't need to. Nora, who had spent all this time absorbing electricity from the 1A student, shot forward in a ball of lightning. The electricity around her compacted and coalesced around her fist, and a single punch to where Yang's blast had burned Nomu deepest sent it flying back. Jaune suddenly felt himself moving and was brought behind his teacher, Professor Goodwitch having grabbed him and his classmates with the telekinesis provided by her quirk.
"Mr. Ark,"
she said, then asked him if he was alright after taking that hit. Before Jaune could respond, something seemed to spark in the eyes of the woman Professor Goodwitch had been fighting.
"Ark?"
In the brief pause of fighting, more students had arrived, as explosions erupted between the woman in a black mask and Professor Goodwitch. At the same time, a mountain of ice surrounded the already injured Nomu. Katsuki Bakugo and Shoto Todoroki had arrived. Not a moment later, the shadowy villain also appeared, telling the leader of the villains that one of the students had escaped. Deathstalker, who Jaune now saw was missing the tip of his tail, said that they should leave. The leader began angrily itching at his face, but the woman in black glared at him and said that they were going. Nomu burst from the ice, but at the cost of multiple limbs, and with Aizawa still staring him down, he couldn't regenerate. With that, the leader finally agreed, and they, along with several of the villains scattered throughout the USJ, were warped away. Bakugo wanted to follow them, but was held back by Goodwitch's telekinesis, the teacher knowing that her foremost priority at the moment was to protect the students. Shortly afterward, All Might and the rest of the UA teachers arrived. After authorities and medical professionals arrived, Jaune was able to check in with his friends. While most everyone had scrapes and bruises, the only ones with serious injuries were the Class 1A professor and Yang. The student who'd been able to escape and alert the teachers had been none other than Trivia Vanille, who'd been able to create an illusory copy of herself that hot-wired the bus they had arrived on and drove it back to UA. While Jaune was impressed, he was a bit disconcerted by how much autonomy Trivia's clones seemed to have. While Ruby or Izuku's friend Ida likely would have been faster, both of them had been sent to different areas in the USJ. Ida had apparently tripped on something, though he didn't know what, and was sent to the Conflagration Zone. Meanwhile, Ruby along with Weiss had been sent to the Flood Zone with the 1A student named Tsuyu Asui, at least until the three of them had easily made an escape and Ruby and Weiss made their way to the center of the USJ. Meanwhile, Izuku had been sent to the Downpour Zone, which explained why three of his friends were soaking wet. Jaune also got the chance to ask Ren why his normally calm friend was so aggressive toward Deathstalker. Hesitantly, Ren told his friends his story. How many years ago, Tyrion Kalos, the man called Deathstalker, had gone on a killing spree in a town called Kuroyuri, and how Ren's parents had been two of his victims. Ren himself might have been as well, if not for his quirk activating. Ren's quirk was called Tranquility. and along with allowing him to detect strong emotions in the area surrounding him, it also allowed him to calm people's emotions, including his own. Ren witnessed Deathstalker's attack on his parents, and it was only thanks to tranquility that he could remain calm and hide until the villain had left. Jaune couldn't think of anything to say other than to apologize that Deathstalker had escaped. Ren clenched his fists but shook his head, thanking Jaune for saving him against the Nomu. The others took this chance to change the subject, commenting that it was impressive Jaune was able to stop that villain in its tracks when even Yang had been unable to absorb the full force of its attack. Nora commented that it almost seemed like something only All Might could have done. Jaune, not wanting to discuss his power, especially at the mention of All Might, and also seeing that Ruby had grown saddened at the mention of her sister, tried to think of something else to talk about, and found his saving grace when the 3 1A students he had fought villains with walked up to them. The 3 introduced themselves as Momo Yaoyorozu, Kyokajiro, and Denki Kaminari. They wanted to thank Jaune for his help in fighting those villains, since the amount of them might have been overwhelming, given Kaminari couldn't do widespread attacks without also hitting his allies, and that's not even mentioning the other electric quirk user that had been there. Jaune brushed it off, saying that Kaminari and Nora had been the only reason he'd survived against the Nomu. The group spoke for a while after that before being dismissed and told they could go home. As Jaune fell asleep that night, he had the fleeting thought that he'd never asked Pyrrha why Deathstalker had been after her, and by the time he woke up, he'd forgotten about it. When the students returned to school, it was announced that the UA Sports Festival would soon be occurring. At lunch that day, Jaune was called into his father's office. All Might apologized to his son that he hadn't been there during the USJ, but told him he was proud of how Jaune had handled himself, of how well he had protected his classmates. Jaune was happy to receive this praise from his father, but he couldn't help the nagging in the back of his head. The words his father had spoken to him in anger all those years ago. He still hadn't been able to do anything on his own. Even if he'd saved Ren, both of them would have died if not for Nora's intervention. Pyrrha had been the one to handle Kalos, and it had been a team effort with the 1A students to fight against that initial group of villains. He was happy for the praise, but he didn't feel he'd earned it. All Might didn't notice the turmoil behind his son's smile. Instead, he continued on, telling Jaune that the upcoming sports festival would be his opportunity to introduce himself to the world, to say, "I am here," and show everyone the kind of hero he was going to be. Jaune clenched his teeth and nodded, silently swearing that he would prove himself. In the time he had to prepare for the sports festival, Jaune worked on training his newfound ability, telling his father about it and his theory that it was a quirk within One For All that was beginning to emerge. All Might took note of this and told Jaune that he would begin researching the previous holders of One For All to get as much information as he could in case others started showing up. Jaune was able to hone his control of this danger sense to a certain extent, but he hadn't mastered it. And in what felt like the blink of an eye, the sports festival had arrived. The event began somewhat humorously, as Ruby Rose, who had scored the most points in the practical exam, had to deliver a speech to the entire crowd. The awkward girl, who was 2 years younger than anyone else in her year, muttered a few words into the microphone before just saying,
Plus ultra?
And using her quirk to race back to her class. When she arrived next to him, Jaune patted her back in understanding and said,
To the socially awkward.
When the first event of the sports festival began, it turned out somewhat anticlimactic, at least for Jaune. His danger sense warned him of Todoroki's ice attack, which allowed him to avoid it, but from there 5 students clearly made their mark, and he wasn't one of them. By the very nature of her quirk, Ruby was built for this challenge. She blazed forward, bypassing the robots, the pitfall, and even the landmines. Seeing this, both Katsuki Bakugo and Shoto Todoroki raced after her. After them, Penny did the same thing as Ruby, though a bit slower, using her lasers to fly across the course and avoid all the obstacles. And once Pyrrha faced off against the robot obstacle, all she needed was to use her quirk to pry off a piece of metal, and she did the exact same thing, riding it as though it were a magic carpet. Jaune could only watch this happen. He was faster than just about everyone else in the competition, save for Tenya Ida, and he could use Danger Sense to avoid some obstacles like the landmines, but he wasn't able to use a high enough percentage of One For All to catch up to the leaders. So as Jaune arrived in 6th place, not even placing in the top 5, he couldn't help but feel angry at his own weakness. Coming 6th out of 64 students that will move on to the next round wasn't bad, but compared to the standard Jaune was holding himself to, it wasn't nearly good enough. This anger was replaced with sympathy for his friend when he learned of Ruby's million-point predicament. He offered to be on Ruby's team for the next competition, and so did Penny. Ruby was just relieved she had been able to find some teammates already. With him, Ruby, and Penny on a team, though, an idea formed in Jaune's head. He called over Izuku, and his oldest friend agreed to be on their team as well. A girl named Mei Hatsume, who Ruby had apparently met in support course classes, tried to join their team as well, but left when she found that it was already full. With his team gathered, Jaune told them his idea. When the cavalry battle started, countless teams lunged for Ruby, but she and her team were already high in the air. Jaune's plan came down to constant movement, namely, him constantly moving. While 3 people would normally be cumbersome, even for him, both Izuku and Penny had the ability to hover in place. And with Izuku being able to secure them all together with Black Whip, all Ruby needed to do was hold on tight while Jaune kept them away from the others. This also left Penny open to be on defense, which was helpful as she blasted away Katsuki Bakugo, who immediately chased after them with explosions. After the initial attack, it was simple work for Jaune. He only needed to keep running and listening to his danger sense, and they would be able to hold on to their million points easily. Or that's how it should have been, if not for the massive wall of ice that Jaune nearly crashed into, only avoiding it thanks to danger sense. Facing down Jaune's team was Shoto Todoroki, Momo Yaoyorozu, Tenya Ida, and Pyrrha Nikos. After she'd seen that Jaune had teamed up with other people already, Pyrrha's competitive spirit sparked within her, and she decided to team up with some of Class A's most elite students. Jaune tried to stick to the plan, running in the opposite direction from the enemy team, but he was cut off almost immediately by Ida. He wasn't sure how until he saw metal discs beneath the feet of Pyrrha and Yaoyorozu, obviously created by Yaoyorozu and being controlled by Pyrrha. It seems someone on their team had the same idea as Jaune did. A battle of the 2 teams ensued. Todoroki tried to cut them off and capture them using his ice, but Penny would use her lasers to break through enough for them to escape. All the while, Jaune and Ida raced back and forth, moving all around the stadium and passing by team after team. After minutes passed of this back and forth, both young men had to stop to breathe. Jaune was about to race off again when he saw that Ida had started running in the other direction. It was then that he heard Ruby yell no, and saw the bandana representing their points being pulled directly into Todoroki's hand by a single metal screw.
I'm sorry,
he heard Pyrrha call. Jaune couldn't bear the thought of them losing then, not even making it to the final round, and so, without even thinking, he increased the percentage of one for all in his body, and leapt after the other team. Jaune felt the bones in his legs snap as he appeared in front of Todoroki, reaching out to grab his team's points back. Todoroki's eyes widened, and for just a moment, his left side erupted in flames. Unfortunately, that moment was enough, as Penny used her lasers to pull their team back so Jaune wouldn't be burned. As Jaune reached the ground, his broken legs crumpled beneath him. It was only thanks to Izuku and Penny holding Ruby up that they weren't disqualified from her touching the ground. Jaune went to stand up, but before he could even try, the buzzer sounded. As it was announced that Team Todoroki had won first place with over 1 million points, Jaune let his head fall into his hands. He'd failed. He'd failed his friends. He'd failed his father. He'd failed himself. But then, it was announced that second place was Team Rose. Jaune looked up in confusion and then back at his team. Ruby was confused as well. Then Jaune looked at Izuku, who was holding a small bundle of headbands in his hands.
Well, while we were running around, there wasn't anything I could do to help, so I just used my whips to grab whatever I could. We were going so fast, I don't think anyone noticed that it was us.
Jaune leapt up and wrapped his friend in a big hug, then immediately fell back to the ground because his legs were broken. Jaune was carted off to Recovery Girl after that, but learned that the other 2 teams that were moving on to the final round were Team Belladonna and Team Shinzo, though apparently one of the members of that team forfeited their spot for some reason, so it went to a boy named Tetsu. Team Bakugo had been one of the favorites to move on, but apparently Neon Cat, one of Jaune's classmates, had annoyed Bakugo so much that he spent the entire time going after Team Cole, instead of trying to get more points.
Well, that's one way to deal with an enemy.
Meanwhile, Team Ren had been disqualified when Nora, being charged up by both Kaminari and a boy named Nolan from the general course, ran so fast that Ren was simply left behind and fell to the ground. Jaune felt a bit bad for his friends that didn't make it to the final round, but overall he was simply relieved that he had made it. That relief wouldn't last long, however, as after he was released from Recovery Girl's office, Shoto Todoroki pulled him aside to have a discussion. Cinder Falls sat in the League of Villains hideout, watching the televised broadcast of the UA Sports Festival. As the cavalry battle came to an end, she smirked. The Arc Boy was doing well. It was to be expected, of course, with a quirk such as his, but still, she was glad to see he would be going into the final round. Amplification. Such an interesting and varied ability. As the students went on break for the final round, Cinder created a small flame in her hand. She stared into it and within her mind reminisced. As a child, Cinder Fall dreamed of heroes. She dreamed that one day they would come for her, come and take her away from the orphanage she lived in, and then she dreamed that they would come and save her from the cruel mother that had adopted her. Even as her adopted sisters tormented her, even as the matron used her quirk to shock her any time she stepped out of line, Cinder still dreamed of heroes, because if anyone could save her, it would be them. She just needed to wait, to hold out until the heroes would come for her. And then one day, a hero did come. He confronted the matron about her actions, about what she'd done to Cinder. Cinder could finally be saved, and then the matron gave him a fine sum of money. And suddenly, he hadn't seen anything. After that, Cinder still dreamed of heroes, but those dreams were filled with hate. Hate for how they didn't save her. Hate for how they could do whatever they wanted with no repercussions. And hate for the power that they had and that she lacked. Cinder's quirk, Scorching Caress, was pathetically weak. Whereas some people could generate waves of fire, all Cinder could do was heat up the palm of her hand. Out of all the heroes, she hated the numbers 1 and 2 the most. All Might, the so-called symbol of peace, hadn't brought an ounce of peace into her life at all. An endeavor she envied. She envied his power so like hers, yet so much more. And she envied his freedom to burn anyone that got in his way. One day, she heard about a man, though some called him a demon lord, who could grant power in exchange for service. She knew what she needed to do, but the matron and her sisters would never let her go. So they were found the next day dead, with handprints burned around their necks. And when Cinder was later confronted by the pathetic hero that ignored her all those years ago, she did the same to him. And after months of searching, Cinder found who she was looking for, and at the age of 15, pledged herself to All for One. All for One would not grant her wish of power immediately. First, she needed to prove herself, so for years she did whatever he asked of her. She was an enforcer, an assassin, anything that All for One needed. She even helped to train Tomura Shigaraki, given the two of them had similar requirements for using their quirks in battle. And she resented how All for One favored him. Finally, All for One gave her the chance she'd been waiting for. He told her to pick any quirk she desired, and if she could procure its holder, it would be hers. Cinder was prepared for this, and she had done her research. In the early days of quirks, Jonah Arc had been one of the first vigilantes in France, going by the name Crocea Mors. His quirk was nothing too impressive. Called Sharpening, it simply allowed him to make the sword he used in his vigilante activities particularly sharp. Meanwhile, his wife had an early incarnation physical enhancer quirk. Their son, though believed to be quirkless, chose to continue in his father's footsteps in becoming a vigilante. Surprising when his father had been found dead in the streets, with his precious sword broken in half. Still, the son took up his father's broken sword and wore a suit of armor, becoming known in France as the Rusted Knight. And though he was first believed to be quirkless, he found in the last years of his life that he did have a quirk. This was the first appearance of the quirk known as Amplification. This iteration of the quirk so laughably weak, its user didn't even know it existed until he was in his late 30s, and it didn't save him when he died too, pathetic and alone. Even before his death, the Rusted Knight's son had been moved to America by his mother, not wanting the child to become a vigilante like his father. And while he didn't become a vigilante, His discovery of the first actually usable version of amplification led him to the path of a pro-hero. So he took the name of his grandfather and became the second Crocea Moors. The Crocea Moors of America, some called him. And much like his father and grandfather, he died in his line of work fighting a villain. How quaint. Those arcs really had a tendency to die useless deaths, didn't they? And in the case of the second Crocea Moors, he died before he even got the chance to see the birth of his second daughter. Speaking of that second daughter, Amber Arc, the pro-hero who called herself Autumn. Cinder knew that amplification was the quirk that she desired, and while she'd have loved to find Amber's older half-sister, who by all accounts had a more powerful version of that quirk, she'd apparently gone off the grid years ago. So Autumn would have to do. With All for One's backing, it was simple work to find some henchmen to help her in the job of capturing the pro-hero, and with a simple bit of trickery, it was done. Cinder still remembered Amber's pathetic little "Please don't," when One for All placed his hand upon her face. And when One for All tried to give amplification to Cinder, Cinder told him to wait. She knew that the scientist known as Garaki could create copies of quirks. She also knew that All for One would often use different versions of similar quirks to enhance their properties. Cinder couldn't wait the years it would take for amplification to reach a level suitable for use. So she asked All for One to put multiple copies inside of her. All for One asked if she was certain. She knew that the purpose of the Nomu's modification was so they could handle multiple quirks. Did she really want to tempt fate and see if she could naturally? She did, and wouldn't you know it, she could. Cinder was pulled out of her reverie from a sharp pain in her head. She grit her teeth, but then smiled. Maybe she could take the Arc Boy's quirk as well. If the USJ was anything to go by, he likely had the most powerful copy of amplification there's ever been. All the more power for her. She stood up as the TV announced that the sports festival would be returning in a moment. She needed to get going. The real show would soon begin. And she had her part to play. After all, they'd been able to escape with so many villains from the USJ. It'd be a shame to not put them to use. It was time. The bracket was set, the crowd were in their seats, and the final round of the UA Sports Festival was about to begin. Despite that, Jaune sat reticent in his seat, his mind caught up in the talk that he'd had with Todoroki in the break. The conversation started off poorly, with Todoroki accusing Jaune of being All Might's secret love child. Jaune tried to deny it, but it was close enough to the truth that he didn't think Todoroki believed him. The conversation didn't get better from there. Quirk marriages being bred to surpass All Might, Todoroki swearing to never use half of his quirk. It was all just so much that Jaune didn't know how to process it. And he didn't know what to do. Should he tell his father? The faculty? Should he try to talk to Todoroki again? Or maybe even confront Endeavor? Jaune scratched that last idea off the list because he didn't think it would go well for him. He wished he could ask Izuku or Ruby for advice, but that posed the same problem as all his other ideas did. Todoroki had told him this personally. It felt wrong to reveal this to others without his permission. Jaune sighed, but was brought out of his thoughts by Pyrrha tapping his shoulder. She told him that she was going to go prepare for her first bout. Jaune remembered that Pyrrha had been selected for the first fight, while Jaune had been chosen for the second. Jaune wished her luck and she did the same for him, telling him that she would see him in the next round. She said it with a smile, though Jaune could tell by her eyes that she was trying to figure out a way that she would beat him. Logically, Jaune knew that wasn't likely, given Pyrrha didn't have any metal that she could use in their battle, but the slight tingling of his danger sense told him that she may very well find a way. Jaune chuckled nervously as she walked away. He waited a short while, but then followed down to the waiting room. Pyrrha's opponent in this round was just some kid from the general course that Jaune didn't know, so he was pretty sure it was going to be a short battle. The entire time he walked, he thought of his conversation with Todoroki, racking his brain to figure out what he should do. He got to the waiting room just after the match would have been starting. When he opened the door, he heard the announcement that the match was already over. It was fast, even for Pyrrha. But when Jaune turned to the TV screen showing what had happened, it wasn't what he thought. Hitoshi Shinzo had been declared the winner when Pyrrha Nikos walked herself out of the ring. Jaune immediately rushed out, wanting to ask his friend what had happened, but when he asked her, she didn't know. And they didn't have time to try and figure it out, because it was Jaune's turn in the arena. Pyrrha promised to let him know if she could figure it out before he would have to fight him in the next round. Jaune agreed, but asked Pyrrha if she was alright. Pyrrha shook her head but smiled, saying that it was just a bit of wounded pride. Jaune patted his friend on the shoulder and walked past her, preparing to face Momo Yaoyorozu in battle. This was another battle that, logically, you'd think Jaune would be able to finish quickly. But the reality was another matter. Jaune's thoughts, now both consumed by what had happened to Pyrrha and Todoroki's conundrum, were muddled and left him slow on the uptake when the battle began. It was just for a moment, but that moment was all it took for Momo to put her plan into action. She had seen Jaune fight in the USJ, and knew she wouldn't be able to beat him in a head-on battle, so instead she went the route of trickery, immediately creating and setting off multiple stun grenades, along with creating protection for herself. Jaune was blinded, and Momo used this opportunity to go on the attack. It was only thanks to Danger Sense that Jaune was able to dodge most of Momo's strikes, and even then his imperfect mastery of the quirk meant that he couldn't dodge all of them, or else he would risk overextending himself and leaving the arena. Momo also timed it so that when Jaune was regaining his sight, she would be too far away for him to reach and would set off another stun grenade. Jaune was at an impasse. He could comfortably control around 8 to 10% of One For All at a time, but was only using 5% in this battle. He didn't want to accidentally hurt his classmate, especially one that he had fought villains with at the USJ. If Jaune could use his current maximum, then he could easily catch up to Momo in the intervals between stun grenades and take her out of the ring. But if he went too fast and accidentally hit her, he could seriously injure her. On the other hand, he felt like he was being made a fool of, especially when he was able to dodge a rope that was aimed at his legs by jumping, only to be hit by a second one Momo had sent slightly higher. Jaune needed to think of a solution. He didn't want to lose here, especially after what had happened to Pyrrha. He wanted to avenge his friend and eliminate the person who had eliminated her. Then Jaune thought of something. When he was speaking to Pyrrha once, she had mentioned that the way she fought, she needed to control each individual piece of metal that was attached to her body, to ensure that she moved at the right speed and angle that she would accomplish what she was trying to do. Maybe Jaune could do the same thing. He pictured how he had been using One For All when he had first received it, flooding a single limb with 100% of the power. Now he needed to bring half of his body up to 10%, while keeping the other half at 5%. And given if he messed it up, he would probably eliminate himself, Jaune only had one shot at it. And so Jaune stopped all unnecessary movement, taking more strikes from Yaoyorozu, but also tracking where she was in the arena. He ignored all but the most severe warnings from Danger Sense, and focused entirely on trying to balance the power in his body. And so, in the single moment he had of sight, he opened his eyes and dashed toward his opponent. His control of it was clunky, and he did end up falling out of the arena, but only after Yaoyorozu had already touched the ground. Jaune sighed at how embarrassing he must have looked throughout that match, but got up and offered his hand to Yaoyorozu, telling her that it had been a good fight. Momo was disappointed to have lost, but was proud of how well she'd fared against one of the powerhouses of her year, and she returned Jaune's good match. Jaune returned to his seats and began watching the other matches. In the fight between Izuku and Trivia, Jaune's friend unfortunately lost. Even with Float, Trivia had been too tricky for Izuku's tactics to overcome. And the next fight was over almost as quickly as Pyrrha vs. Shinzo had been, with Tetsu charging at Izuku's friend Uraraka, only for her to touch him and remove his gravity, pushing him over the side and releasing him. The next battle, while not as flashy as the one between Jaune and Momo, was one of the best showcases of battle prowess thus far. In almost a pure face-off of martial arts, Ojiro and Yang traded blows. Fist met tail over and over again, until finally, after taking a heavy hit, Yang activated her semblance, grabbed her opponent by his tail, and threw him from the arena. The next fight was a battle of speed, as Ida faced off against Ruby. And as one might expect, the battle was quite quick. While the speed of the two students was comparable, Ruby simply wasn't as strong of a hand-to-hand combatant as Ida was, normally relying on support items that she made herself in battle. And while Ruby was also registered in the support course, being one of those members of Class 1L that took multiple courses, as a Hero Course student she wasn't allowed to bring in any support items for the sports festival. The next match was a somewhat similar story. While Blake's quirk allowed her to last longer than many would, Penny's pure versatility eventually overwhelmed her. The final match was between Sun Wukong, a member of Class 1L, and Shoto Todoroki. Jaune had seen Sun fight in battle training. Not only was he an extremely talented fighter, but he had an incredible quirk. It allowed him to create multiple clones of himself at the exact same strength that he was. But none of that mattered against Todoroki, as the moment the round started, a mountain of ice appeared in front of him, trapping Sun within it. Jaune couldn't help but swallow nervously at the thought of having to go up against that if he made it to the final round. And that was only Todoroki at half strength. Jaune clenched his fists. When the next round of fights were about to begin, Pyrrha told Jaune to not respond to anything Shinzo said, believing that that was what activated his quirk and allowed him to control Pyrrha. Jaune listened to Pyrrha, even when Shinzo started taunting him about beating her. And once the battle properly began, he simply dashed over, grabbed, and deposited Shinzo outside of the ring. Shinzo seemed upset afterward, and Pyrrha went to go speak to him. Jaune wasn't sure about what, but they seemed to be in good spirits afterward. In the following battle, Trivia easily beat Uraraka. While Trivia often relied on her illusions, she was also a prodigiously talented fighter, and was especially adept at evading people, making it so Uraraka couldn't grab her to activate her quirk. Later, Izuku also told Jaune that Uraraka had been feeling guilty throughout the tournament. She had been on Shinzo's team in the cavalry battle, and the same thing that had caused one of the other students to drop out of the tournament had happened to her. However, she wanted to show what she could do, so she didn't drop out of the tournament even though she hadn't properly earned it. It made Jaune realize that Trivia had also been on Shinzo's team, but the girl hadn't spoken in the entirety of the time that she'd been at UA. Jaune wondered if she had another reason for choosing to join Shinzo's team, or if she just thought it seemed like a fun idea. The next fight was the most exciting one the tournament had seen thus far. It starting off with Yang declaring that she would avenge her little sister's loss against Ida. While against Ojiro, Yang hadn't used her quirk until the end. In this battle, she activated it from the very beginning. So while Yang was on the back foot in the beginning, being unable to keep up with Ida's speed, as time went on, she only grew stronger with each blow that she took. And while Yang was only increasing in power, Ida was slowing down, both from general exhaustion and from the thermal energy Yang was releasing, causing his engines to overheat. In the end, though it was a close fight, Yang won the battle of attrition. Then, the battle between Penny and Todoroki shocked nearly everyone. Todoroki started off with a massive wall of ice as he had in his first round, but Penny broke through it with her lasers. She dashed toward him with incredible speed, and with a single punch, nearly launched him out of the arena. Todoroki only barely catching himself with a wall of ice. Todoroki tried to counterattack, but Penny's speed, strength, and versatility simply left him no openings to get an attack with his ice through. Just when it seemed like Penny was about to win, she stopped. It seemed that she was speaking to Todoroki, even as she practically held him aloft over the edge of the arena. Then, she dropped him within the arena and stepped out. She walked away as Todoroki looked shocked and angry behind her. When the rest of Class 1L tried to ask Penny what it was about, she simply shook her head and said that she didn't want to keep fighting, releasing a hiccup afterward. The first semifinal match was Jaune versus Trivia, and Jaune felt the weight on his shoulders. His first match, he'd made a fool of himself, and his second one was barely a match at all. If he made it to the final round against Todoroki, he was just as likely to lose immediately as he was to actually do something impressive. This was Jaune's last chance to really prove himself, what he'd been trying to do for the entire sports festival. These thoughts were in his head as he entered the arena, and as Trivia looked him over, it was like she was seeing right through him. And just before the match began, an almost sadistic smile spread across her face. As soon as the fight started, it ended, as Trivia took a bow and stepped out of the arena. Had she chosen to do that just so Jaune couldn't show off his skills? Jaune grit his teeth and went back to his seat, head hanging. The next semifinal match was just as short. Even as Yang punched her own hand to activate her semblance, it wasn't enough to ward off Todoroki's ice. As Todoroki stepped out of the arena, Jaune's classmate yelled at him that he was a cheap fighter. And so it was decided that the final round would be Jaune Arc versus Shoto Todoroki. The competitors were given a short break to allow themselves to rest up after their most recent fights, though honestly neither of them truly needed it. During this time, Jaune went on a walk. So many thoughts filled his head. What he should say to Todoroki, how or even if he should try to help, and of course the overarching worry that he'd failed his father's request to show the world what kind of hero he would be in the sports festival. After a while, he simply sat and leaned his head against a wall, lost. Then he heard a certain silver-eyed girl walk up next to him and say,
"Hey, Jaune."
Jaune was surprised for a moment, but greeted Ruby. She asked him if he was okay, and at first he tried to say he was fine, but couldn't keep it up at Ruby's inquisitive look.
Who am I kidding? I keep making a fool of myself in all these events. Todoroki needs help that I can't give him, and I'm just starting to think coming to this school was a mistake.
Ruby pondered her friend's words for a second before responding with a simple,
"Nope."
Jaune was confused and asked,
"No?" "Nope."
Ruby sat down next to him. She told him that they were heroes now, or at least on their way. If they had the chance to help someone or do something great, they didn't have the choice not to try.
But what if I try and still fail? "Nope." You know, you're not the easiest person to talk to about this stuff. "Nope."
Ruby told Jaune that as heroes, people were relying on them. So even if they thought they were going to fail, they still had to try their best. Jaune thanked Ruby, then heard over the announcement that he needed to get ready for his match. As he was walking toward the arena, he came across Endeavor. Their encounter was brief. Endeavor seemed to size Jaune up, sneering at his similarities to the #1 hero, and then told him to try his best to try and draw out Shoto's fire. He said that his son was being obstinate, and that he needed to learn. As Endeavor started walking away, Jaune's fists clenched.
"Well, maybe if you were a better father, your children would actually want to listen to you."
When Endeavor's fiery glare turned toward Jaune, he squeaked out a quick,
Sir,"
and then ran off to the arena. Jaune met Todoroki in the arena. The two stared each other down before the match started, and Jaune asked him,
"Are you serious about never using your fire in battle?"
Todoroki glared at him, one similar to his father, and said, "You're one to talk about holding back in battle." Jaune's eyes widened. Of course people had noticed that he had more power inside of him, but he didn't have a choice in holding back. If he didn't, his power destroyed his body. Jaune felt his anger rising at Todoroki's words. He got into a battle stance and prepared to fight. But right before the final battle would commence, the PA system screeched, and a different voice began speaking from it. It was a feminine voice, a voice Jaune recognized from the USJ. As an air of confusion settled over the stadium, the woman spoke. She spoke of how Hero Society was broken, how it had been broken for a long time, and that the Hero Academies were the clearest example of it. As the woman spoke, the faculty and pro heroes tried to figure out what was happening, and in the national broadcast of the sports festival, videos began showing as the woman spoke. She spoke of how UA allowed someone with a quirk as dangerous as brainwashing to attend their academy without offering any kind of training to ensure he could control it. The video showed Shinzo ordering Pyrrha to walk out of the arena, with what many could see as a cruel smile on his face. She spoke of how UA was training the #2 hero's son, who was so cold and cruel that he would not hold back against even his own schoolmates. The feed showed Todoroki's battles thus far. It showed Sun helplessly frozen solid, and Yang shouting at Todoroki's back. The woman commented how similar the young Todoroki seemed to his father. And the woman spoke of how UA allowed a student who would choose to mutilate an opponent they were fighting to be enrolled through recommendation. The feed showed Pyrrha accelerating her shield using her quirk to cut off Deathstalker's tail. It was carefully cut to not show how Deathstalker was trying to kill Professor Aizawa. The woman assured her listeners that things were no better at Shiketsu or Tetsubutsu Academy, and she told them that the only way to make things change was to burn down what was already there. As the woman finished her speech, Jaune heard explosions sound around the arena. Screams sounded from the audience, and the pro heroes tried to keep everyone calm. But then someone called out that there were villains, hundreds of them outside. President Mike told everyone to stay inside the arena, and pro heroes flooded out to fight the oncoming threat. The students' viewing areas were closed down to keep them safe, and shielding went up to protect the audience. Even from the center of the arena, Jaune could see his father and Endeavor leaping outside to face the threat. Jaune also noticed that, despite everything, the cameras broadcasting the event still seemed to be rolling. Midnight and Cementos tried to get Jaune and Todoroki to leave the arena, but suddenly gray sludge flowed from their mouths, and in a moment they were gone. Jaune and Todoroki stood frozen, unsure of what to do, until suddenly, appearing out from gray sludge in front of them, was the Nomu from the USJ. Todoroki immediately threw up a wall of ice, but the Nomu smashed through it. Todoroki was obviously tired from the heavy usage of his quirk throughout the day. Jaune raced forward and threw a punch at it, but the 10% power didn't even make it flinch, its shock resistance being too powerful. The monster grabbed his arm and threw him out of the way. As it raced toward Todoroki, he sent his ice and froze Nomu's leg, causing it to break off and stumble for a moment that allowed Todoroki to get out of the way. It turned and would have just as quickly crushed Todoroki if Jaune hadn't raced forward and grabbed his schoolmate out of the way. And Jaune noticed something else. At the USJ, the Nomu had been hurt by the inferno set off by Yang's quirk. Todoroki knew this, but he still wasn't using his fire. Jaune asked about this, and Todoroki glared, the emotion in his eyes darting between anger and fear and desperation. He said that he didn't need his father's quirk. Jaune stared in disbelief. Even now, when there were no other heroes around, and they were the only ones who could stop this Nomu. Jaune yelled at him. "Are you serious right now? There were people in danger!" He was so distracted that they both nearly died as the Nomu appeared in front of him, only being saved by another ice wall from Todoroki. This one was stronger, Shoto having had the opportunity to prepare for it as Jaune saved him from the Nomu. Now having a moment of relative peace, Jaune stared down his classmate. "You want to be a hero, right?" Todoroki's eyes widened at the words, but Jaune continued speaking. "You have an incredible quirk, and it's only ever been yours." Not like Jaune. Jaune hadn't really earned his place at this academy. It had only been because of his father's quirk that he'd been able to do anything. "We all want to be heroes, every one of us in the hero course, but there are no guarantees. We could all fail." Jaune thought of Ruby as he heard the ice shatter behind him. "But we still have to try, with everything we have." A massive amount of energy flooded Jaune's body. This Nomu, Jaune could tell that anything below 100% of his power would do nothing against it. But Jaune couldn't risk losing his mobility in this moment by breaking his legs. Luckily, in his fight against Momo, he'd found a solution to this. Jaune maintained his 10% in the lower half of his body, even as the lightning around his arms and chest turned white. If All Might were to fight the Nomu, it would take him over 300 blows to overcome the shock absorption and regeneration the monster had. But in his prime, it would have taken only 5. And while Jaune had not yet achieved the build of his father in his prime, the power of One for All had only grown. Jaune's attack took place in the blink of an eye. He stepped to the side to dodge the Nomu's punch, and then started delivering his own. The first strike created enormous wind pressure around them as Jaune's right arm shattered. The second punch landed in the exact same spot, shattering Jaune's left arm. Jaune's third blow left his right arm a mangled and bloody mess, practically turning his bones to dust. Jaune didn't know what pain was worse, the one in his head as Danger Sense screamed at him to stop, or the one in his left arm as he threw his fourth attack. But Jaune could see that he was actually doing something, that all of those strikes in a single spot had actually damaged the Nomu. If he could just land one more hit. Unfortunately, the pain in his arms was so great that he slowed down enough for the Nomu to reel back and attack again. Jaune's legs carried him backwards, but it wasn't enough. Or it wouldn't have been, if not for the gout of flames that blazed forward and struck the Nomu. He looked back and saw Shoto Todoroki, left side engulfed in flames, saying that he wanted to be a hero too. As tears streamed from Jaune's eyes, He wondered if this was how Izuku always felt when he started weeping. The Nomu charged forward again, but Todoroki caught its feet in ice, then released an intense flame that blew the Nomu into the sky. Jaune knew that this was his opportunity to finish the battle. He leapt up at 100% power, breaking one of his legs in the process. Flooding his twice-broken right arm with power, Jaune cried out and used one of his father's signature moves.
Detroit! Smash!
And so the Nomu was blown away. As Jaune began to fall, broken and bloodied down to earth, he was caught by the gentle arms of his father. All Might looked down at his son, enraged and heartbroken by the state he was in, but also so proud of how far he had come. Jaune smiled at him tiredly and said,
Hey, Dad. You know, it really hurts your throat to yell out moves like that.
All Might chuckled and said he would get used to it. As he landed and Jaune tried to stand, Todoroki ran up and stood under one of Jaune's arms, helping him balance with only one leg. All Might looked around the stadium. He saw the fear in the audience's eyes, a fear he had become well acquainted with seeing in his childhood. He knew the words of the woman that had hijacked their PA system had gotten to them, not to mention the monster they had just seen nearly killing his students. He cursed in his head. He should have been there in the arena. There had been barely 30 villains outside, despite numerous people reporting that they had seen hundreds. Some kind of mass hallucination? All Might didn't know. What he did know was that he needed to assuage the crowd's fears. He needed to act as the symbol of peace. So he smiled, and he laughed at the woman's declarations, saying that it was clear she was wrong about the hero academies, and that the future was in good hands with students like the two in front of him, pointing out how against all odds they had been able to fight off that villain all on their own. Some people were calmed, but many weren't, and All Might knew that this would only get worse once the press covered it, unless he gave them something else to talk about. In his head, he apologized to Jaune.
Why, you would expect nothing less from these two. The son of the number 2 hero Endeavor,
All Might paused.
and my own son, Jaune.
Jaune looked up at his father in shock.
And I'm so proud of my boy.
The crowd erupted in a confusion much more excited than the one they'd held earlier. Almost all traces of fear gone from them. Luckily, Jaune could dodge any questions for the moment, as he was brought immediately to Recovery Girl and put under for surgery on his arms. Many hours later, Jaune was finally discharged, his arms in casts. He would need to continue healing for quite a while, but he could at least walk around the UA campus now that most people had left. As Jaune meandered about, he came across Todoroki, staring into the sunset. He saw Jaune, and as the two locked eyes, they shared a wordless understanding with each other. Jaune went and sat beside him. The two boys, the sons of Endeavor and All Might, stared off into the horizon, uncertain of what the future would bring.